just got done last week.
Ooh.
I know, I got both of them. This one's a little
Did
smaller.
it hurt?
This one really did, yeah. But
Yeah, my wife has, well, she also had various infections along the way too, which is tough, but yeah. I'm like, yeah, this is just like subtle.
it is. It
Like,
is.
if you
I
see
always
it,
thought
you
about
see
it. I'm
it.
like, nah, I don't think I'm gonna gauge
Yeah,
it, but I could do
yeah,
questions.
and I probably could go one or two more, but I just kind of been this stage for a while.
Mhm.
So it works. Although my mom still tries to give me earrings, I'm like, it's not what this is
Thanks,
explaining.
Mom. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you.
I've always wondered, like, do you just hook them in there? Like,
I'm like, I guess I could.
I already told Dean Towns, but I will end up calling you probably Dean Sada.
No.
I'm gonna try, but it's just ingrained in there.
Okay,
That that's who you are.
let it go.
I've
Slowly
been
but surely.
practicing.
You can still call her Dean.
Yes.
I don't have any of those titles anymore.
Well, you know, you're a graduate now, so you could use my first name.
Oh wow, that is an upgrade and an honor.
Yeah, that's my
Dean
name.
Towns.
You're going to have to train yourself out of it.
There's only one person I can do it with. Everyone knows who that person is. Victor.
Oh. Him.
Him, that one.
Yeah, we both got egg salad. Look at us, old school Southerners.
It's like, oh, they got egg salad.
Salad, I'll do
I'm
it.
getting that. Because you don't see it much anymore.
That would really funny as hell.
100% egg salad. Paula, how is it looking? Okay. Yeah, you're welcome.
Not that bad.
And then it was like, oh. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
graphics so I don't drop it. But yeah, Scary Tea and Scary Coffee
you.
and biscotti and everything else as well. But I just wanted to.
No, thank you.
Yeah.
I just assumed it was for Brittany.
I know. It's like, I hope they didn't bring me a damn gift basket. It's for you.
I did say Dean Snar, didn't I? Brittany and I, yeah. We can talk a little. Always, yeah. Dean Towns and Dean Snar here with you for a conversation on religion in the streets. I'm going to turn it over really quickly to our moderator, Brittany Jackson, who's the Chief Operating Officer of Faith Matters Network, which does wonderful work. I first met Brittany through an organization or a program called the Micah Fellows, which really brought together on-the-ground community and faith leaders all throughout Arkansas to get them mobilized together around anti-poverty work, using what was called the ALICE framework, which had to do a lot with just the legal difficulties of low-wage earners. So I'm happy to welcome you all here. I'll turn it over to Brittany. She'll set the stage for you and take it away.
Thank you, Aaron. And also, hey, Lindsay, who was also a part of that program as a speaker. So lots of good friends here in the room. I'm Brittany, and I thought we might just start with a brief grounding to kind of bring us into the room. You know, we've all walked in here now and spent a few minutes, but preparing us for the conversation. So I invite you to do whatever makes you feel comfortable, but try and get your feet on the ground. Try to get things out of your hands, and take a couple of deep breaths. And as we are starting here this afternoon, just thinking about what were some of the reasons why you joined us today? What were you hoping to take away? A couple of deep breaths at your own pace. What did you hope to learn today? And what did you hope to offer today? Take a last deep breath and let it out. And I will welcome you all back into the room now, prepared for conversation, and really excited to start off this series. As Erin mentioned, I'll be here for the next 4 weeks, hey. So I'll be around. And I am the Chief Operating Officer at Faith Matters Network. We were founded here in Nashville from another Vanderbilt Divinity alum, Reverend Jennifer Bailey. And I do none of the prophetic work. I do all the administrative work. Hey, I know. Hey. But let me say this. I was really excited when Erin extended this invitation because I feel like I'm here for the same reason I went to Divinity School, which was to learn and to listen and to participate in these types of conversations. So all that to say, you can be the administrative person and still want to be deepening your understanding of this space. I will begin with whomever feels led, but I hope that you might offer Dr. Snar and Dean Towns. What was your aha moment when you think about religion in the streets? Where in your background, before academia preferably, did religion make sense to you outside of a church context?
For me, it was high school. My high school years were 1970 to 73 in Durham, North Carolina. And in 1970, the public schools were desegregated. Excuse me. And turmoil is a good word to use for that time. White flight was in full flight out of Durham. Only 2 high schools in town in the city at that time. One was a predominantly white Durham High School, and the other was Hillside High School that was based in the black community. And there was a lot of jockeying for the attention of the high school students. And the 2 major forces were the Ku Klux Klan, their junior division. Who knew they had a junior division? But they had a junior division, and the Communist Workers' Party. We as kids didn't understand this. And so it was a process of me trying to figure out, well, who my people are, you know? And then also the Panther Party came in, realizing this was a rich field. And it was at that point that I started to remember the pastor I grew up with, Doug Moore, who absolutely insisted that religion had to be both spiritual and social. And that's what I grew up with. And that's really what has shaped me all these years. It's not an either or, it's a both and. So I started to use that category to try to figure out who my people were. And came to discover, well, none of the 3 were. Mostly because no one was seeing for me as I wouldn't say was a devout little kid or a young adult or teenager, but God mattered. Jesus mattered. And I couldn't find room in any of those three groups for that very important thing. And when it became the point where I couldn't join, and I became somewhat of a pariah because I wasn't willing to sign up for something I didn't believe in. Or more importantly, now looking back years later, didn't believe in me. So that's where I'd locate it.
As you can probably imagine, we had a little bit different upbringing, but actually both deeply Southern. But I would say my earliest experience of religion in the streets wasn't necessarily outside of a church context, but was the extension. So I grew up in a Southern Baptist megachurch, about 10,000 members, and in the rise of the religious right. And I like to say our liturgical calendar was Christmas, Easter, and 4th of July. And so my father was very involved in Christian right, things of that sort. But simultaneously, what occurred when I was very young, around 10 or so, was the Iranian Revolution happened. And I remember watching on TV another faith tradition rise up and fundamentally overthrow their government. And it blew my mind. And so I began to be really curious and compelled and to see parallels of people who thought that political systems should be transformed by their faithful practice. When I got to college and my slow theological development, I did a summer internship with Catholic Charities USA and also volunteered with Sojourners. And I remember another moment, it was being on the mall, the Washington Mall, when it was Victory Day for the first Gulf War. And I was doing prayer vigil with Franciscans and Sojourners and having folks sporting their American regalia and Christian symbols walking by while we're praying and spitting on us. And I thought, what this witness means, this kind of public witness, and a witness even against my own Christian traditions, what that means of where power is located. And then finally, early on in my graduate career, I started working with some workers at Emory University where I was going to seminary, and they were the maintenance and grounds crew folks. And through them, started working on living wage issues and got connected to larger living wage networks and began to really realize, even though it had been cast as a secular movement, that actually it was fundamentally grounded on all of this faith-based community organizing networks. And the key figures, particularly in Atlanta, were members of congregations. And so that religion in the streets, the migration of religion, and I know we'll talk more about this, but for me, actually seeing religion as mostly practiced in the streets, that was the site of religion. And so its relationship to Sundays was always very intriguing to me. And so I became very fascinated with anybody who thought they could change the world through action that wasn't just contained within a congregation.
Thank you, Dr. Snar. Just to mention, we will kind of go through a couple of pre-scripted questions, and then I'll open it up for questions from the audience as well. So be thinking about those, and then we'll have some time to chat about comments after we close. I'm wondering about this question. I've told actually a lot of my friends this week that I was going to be talking about religion in the streets. Almost zero of them have any religious, theological training, and they're like, "What do you mean by that?" The streets to me means where my grandma lives. and where I grew up and kind of being out among people like me. And that didn't have a religious connotation for them. I'm wondering if you two might tease out this idea of the streets and how we've come to use that language as common for things related to movement. I'll also just pick on you, Dr. Snar, because you told this great story about being in Appalachia in one of your courses, and it's always stuck with me, kind of you walking through the streets of that town and kind of like being a part of that. It doesn't have to be that story, but I remember it.
I have no idea which story that is, but
It was great.
So part of who I am as an ethicist, I mean, both of us are social ethicists, and decidedly for me, informed by sociology. And so when I think about the practice of religion in the streets actually, for me, captures where most religious practice actually occurs. It may not be, I was sharing this in a homily on Sunday in a congregation, but the kind of sacred ordinary time. Sacred, if you don't follow the Christian liturgical calendar, to me, one of the things that's most fascinating about ordinary time is it's actually the bulk of the Christian calendar. So from Easter to Advent, and none of the lectionary readings make sense together. I mean, they do kind of, but they're not purposely themed. There's no grand liturgical event. But that's actually, the theme of that is where community is formed. And I think about where religion actually is sociologically, it is certainly located in congregations, but the everydayness of how we practice and think and make meaning about our worlds, that's where I think religion is. So it's, did you pray at the dinner table? But it's also, how do you make sense of why I get paid this and not that? And so maybe the story you're referring to is, I went to school, a small southern university, Furman University, and my sociology professor would take me out to the mill towns for lots of different reasons for research. But those were structured by having a Methodist church on one corner of the street and a Baptist church on the other. And the Methodist church was for the managers, and the Baptist church was for the workers. And just thinking about what happened on Sunday constructed the way they interpreted the rest of their week. And so I'm really interested in how they interpreted the rest of their week and acted in that. What kinds of practices were they cultivated into, things of that sort. So to loop back a little bit, religion in the streets to me means actually how religion has formed our dailiness, how it forms us into subservience, how it forms us into resistance, how it is present and not, and how it answers the deep, meaningful questions that don't occur on Sunday mornings, but actually occur on a Tuesday night, at 11:30. To me, that's religion in the streets is definitely protest. It's things of that sort. It's our faith going public, but it's also literally how our streets are formed and connected to each other. So why do our neighborhoods look the way they do? And they're also what happens in those homes, on those street corners, and who you eat with, and all that. So the religion in the streets is literally how our streets are formed, maintained, and upheld, and resisted, I think.
That was the story, so you got it.
And really, it's an echo of Melissa. One of the, when you do public talks, recycle some things, but one of the things that I end a lot of my public talks with is a whole long thing of everydayness. And what I'm trying to convey to the audience and to myself is that it's not these big grand acts we do. that is ethical, that is faith, that is prophetic or pastoral. It's the dailiness of living. For me, what happens when I walk into my office and someone comes in with a variety of things? It is in that moment that I understand myself to be in a sacred time with someone. Because that's, I think, who we are. We're sacred beings. We don't act like it a lot of the time, and certainly many of us have found that we have been tossed aside in that way. But I think it makes a difference. If I understand everyone who comes into my office, into my life, and even people who don't, sacred, that's something that just happens every day. And underneath that is, for me at least, an understanding that all of life is sacred. There's just not a moment in our living that is not sacred. Sometimes it can be sacrilegious, but there is still an element of, I think, humanity at work in the world in some way. So when I think of the phrasing, religion in the streets, it's everywhere. It's everywhere. I have gotten into this habit now of not letting students I don't know pass me by without eye contact or a hello or a nod or something. And they're so shocked when that happens. I'm sort of shocked at myself because I'm naturally I'm an introvert. I usually don't go out. But we've been through something with this pandemic. And I think part of my journey to try to get back into the world, into the streets, is to start to recognize folks as I pass them by or we pass each other by.
Wonderful. Thank you. I just have kind of one more question, and then we'll open it up around the room for any thoughts that have come. Kind of this question, I think you were moving to, Dean Towns, of how do we then engage beyond that sacred time of Sunday in the Christian tradition? How do we move congregations from kind of, I'll say it, idleness in a sermon to action on a Tuesday? That is a voting reference. So make sure you vote.
Do vote. It can't be on Sunday in the pulpit, I don't think. It can be an issued call, but the real work happens the rest of the week as folks are in meetings, out in the community, understanding the scope of some of the issues. You know, I think it's particularly pernicious that we have Amendment 1 that reads, if you're not paying attention to it, like it's a beautiful thing. But if you look deeper, it's sowing the seeds of union busting. The only place I know, at least in most black communities, where you can get a bunch of folk together is in a church and help provide the information folk need in order to do what they need to do. And if they say they want to change the world, or we say we want to change the world, then we have to act like it and get involved. And so offering educational experiences, helping people to understand their faith is not a disconnect from the world. It's just not true. although we try to make it so. So for me, it is those other things we do throughout the week. And then Sunday can be a celebration and it can be a call. But now folks understand what's at stake if we do that from the pulpit.
And Dr. Snar, you shared a very specific example earlier. I'm just curious, how were you drawn out into the streets for some of your experience, and then how do you see others today being pulled out into the streets?
Yeah, I do think I came from a background that expected us, if not in the streets, to be in the legislature. So that's, and maybe that's part of growing up in the Christian right, was this profound sense of we may not be in the world, and we are both in the world, even if we're not of the world, and being constantly socialized towards that. And so I have kind of two different takes on the question. One, again, I'll go sociological. A long time ago, there was a fascinating study by Verba and Schlotzman that went right to Emily's point that what got people involved in political life or in any kind of various forms of political action was not the content of the sermons that they heard on Sundays. But it was rather, and I'm looking at Mike Hodge here, it was rather their socialization and habituation into their agency through the various activities of the church that told them that they had the power to make a difference. And also, I mean, I would add, and Verba and Schlotzman didn't add, but a kind of theological agency. And that doesn't happen. I think the proclamation of word has a very important liturgical place. But this formation in the everydayness of even congregational life makes a difference. And how do we articulate what theologically matters? And how do we have a sense that we make a difference in an institution? There are just not a lot of places in our lives that we feel like we make a difference in an institution, particularly if we're not, like me, part of the kind of most elite. But as their sociology really looked at so well, you know, this is maybe a crass example, but someone who might be on the custodial staff at Vanderbilt might be leading the personnel and policy committee at their church. And what does that mean then for a sense of their moral and political agency? And I think we have neglected in our sense of Christian education that that is about a cultivation of moral agency and theological agency. And that as a kind of everyday practice. And then the other way I'll come at that question is kind of flipping it. Some of my concern now is how do we get the spirituality of the streets to the congregation? And I say that in both ways of how do we see what's happening in the streets as religion? And I think we can talk more. I think there's a lot of cultural, historical, and legal reasons why we just can't even see the religion and spirituality that's in the streets as it is every single day. I mean, the best example of that is Black Lives Matter and the early discourse of it being a secular movement, which it just was not. That's a certain imposition of the term of secularity. But the other thing, both being able to recognize and bring that spirit into congregations, but also because our leaders and everyday activists and folks who are living the kind of life of agitation need the spiritual renewal of non-strategic action. I think not every gathering is a strategic action. Sometimes it's worship. Sometimes it's mystery. Sometimes it's embrace. Sometimes it's falling into the healing of a community. And again, learning from Black Lives Matter on healing justice, it takes communities that are non-commercial to do that. And there's a million fellowships nowadays to do that, but we also need congregations to attend to that heart. So I think there's, it's not that you meant to imply a one-way street, but I think, one-way street, huh? But this this connective process, I think, both to see what's happening in the streets, but also for those who spend more time in the streets to feel places of renewal and even non-strategic action. I think mentors of both of ours, whether it be Katie Cannon or Bev Harrison, talk to the importance of celebration in the kind of social ethics cycle. I would throw that into a theological and liturgical context, that we have to have those spaces of coming together spiritually for a different kind of renewal. And I think that also gets lost sometimes in our conversations.
Yeah, thank you so much. I would love to turn it to our guests here and kind of glean some of the wisdom from the room. I will walk around. And if anyone has a question percolating, I'll come and find you. Oh, you were going to do it? I'll do it. Yeah, I'll get some exercise in, some moving. Yeah, my steps. Hello. Thank you, though.
Thank you both for your thoughts so far along this theme. And as you were both talking, one of the things that stood out to me was the focus on the importance, in a way, of the reclaiming the religious activity of the interpersonal. And I've been mulling this over, this specific engagement of just person to person over the last few days, and thinking about the ways that that type of interaction, small, ordinary time interaction, has really been the focus of some scorched earth policy, right? That we've been, in a sort of small p political sense, really driven to say, if you don't speak, sound, look, say, act in the same ways I do, there's really a barrier in our conversation. Not to say we haven't even tried to have a conversation, so I'm not. And so that's the thought I'm walking in with, thinking about ways that we try to repair that, and hear you all's focus on, in various ways, the importance of that activity as being some of almost the primary stuff of religion in the streets, in the ordinariness of this interaction. How do we go, so what are, solve it right now. Thoughts on how one overcomes the barriers to simply engage in the smallness of the ordinary actions that you're describing. Because I feel like there has been a very intentional walk in some big P politics ways into the small p polis activity of the interpersonal. And thank you in advance.
I'll start with a confession first. So one of my sisters is not speaking to me right now. Hasn't for 8 months, related to politics. And so always speaking from a place of humility, and probably there are also other people in this room that feel the rending, just rending of this political landscape. With that said, too, I think there are a couple of really important things, both historically looking at racial justice movements, and then even in contemporary kind of eruptions of mass mobilization. Belinda Robnett is this incredible author that talks about the way the Black Civil Rights Movement actually succeeded was were all the women who actually did the relational work on the ground, built the relationships to say, okay, it's worth taking this risk. So certainly MLK, other folks you could name, but it was actually these teachers, these nurses, these other folks, and they were doing the real work of creating the possibility for mobilization. So even in just the possibilities of mobilization, and there's been a lot of research lately that even though we're getting these flashes of mass mobilizations, you're not getting sustained movements because of the lack of relational cultivation and trust over time. Also because of what it can survive under totalitarianism and fascism, all that kind of stuff. But the other thing I think is, gosh, this is also, from Sunday's reflection, we're doing stuff on mission and stewardship. You know, it's the kind of Sunday you hate to do stuff on. Honestly.
Seems like it was
because you're
useful
go and make disciples of the world. We've all heard it. And it came back to me, that baptismal sense of being named and claimed as a child of God. And then the mission, and trying to do that with my children in remembering their baptism. Sorry, the move to infant baptism. I know, just give it to me here. But to think about what it means to say that to myself and how it might change the way I engage in politics, and what it means to try to engage folks who are very different from me in that spirit of remembering my baptism, but also remembering that they're a child of God. I have hope for that, because I also think that's, even in our just most basic organizing, unless we have these deep relational connections of political trust, we are too upended too quickly by our small polis is absolutely ripped apart by large P politics. So it's not an answer. It's just it's a hope for that grace goes before and binds us into another form of kingdom. But I'll let the wiser one answer.
The first thing that came to mind was listening. I don't think there is an outbreak of listening in our world right now. And I'm still trying to figure out how we get to that listening. So I don't have the answer to that. But it seems to me that there are lots of sounds. Some of them become words, some of them become shouts, whatever. But that activity of actually listening to someone almost some days feels like a lost art form. And I think some of that comes from a society that now more than I have ever been aware of, where winning and losing is more important than anything else, including the truth. And just don't want to hear it. Don't want to be challenged to rethink what we think. Want to win at all costs. It was, I think sometime last week, I was reading a news paper report, and the reporter was asking a conservative lawmaker or someone, now that you know that Herschel Walker has this history of paying for abortions, and the person didn't even dispute the allegation. Where she went was, I don't care. I want to win the Senate. And I just sat there. And I said words that I won't repeat here, but it just struck me, we are in dangerous times. Even more than I had fully appreciated up to reading that. So I think in terms of what will it take for me to actually listen to someone Now, I try to do it in the classroom. I'm not sure how good I am at it anymore. But there are, one of the things that we've done periodically at the Div School is host listening circles. And the rules are very simple. You cannot talk over anyone. You have to let the person finish speaking. You are not to debate what they said, and everyone in here will respect one another. So the goal is not a goal, really. It's to try to help folks learn how to listen to each other. So.
Might I just piggyback just a little bit about a role of vulnerability, maybe from the speaker as well? Do you feel that there's anything for folks that are trying to kind of step into that role to be listened to, that they have to embody a bit more, perhaps, vulnerability than what we're used to as well?
I think so. And I don't like it. Because usually the folks who are trying to be heard are already in a one-down position. And now they're speaking again. Perhaps more than likely not to be heard again. It's a re-victimization. So perhaps folks need to learn how to tag team that activity. So it's not just one person doing that. But to be very strategic. And to ask the question, are these the people I really want to waste my time and energy on? You know? As a ex of mine used to say, I need to save my breath because I'm going to need it when I'm dying. Is that this group or this person? Or is there any possibility that change just might break out?
I won't take too much more time on that, but I do think there are so I think what's lost in democracy, which is now actually being questioned as whether it's a legitimate political process now in shocking ways, but we have long lost practices of democratic listening, if we ever had them. We haven't cultivated habits that are actually can be done in smaller and then collective power. And maybe I'm, again, nodding to an organizing model in some ways, but there is so much cultural, political trauma that to constantly do the vulnerability in one-on-one feels too much. And so what are the practices of collective listening and kind of staging of democratic practice that just we don't do and we desperately need in order to sustain something that would transform any kind of conversations. So radically individualistic model of listening would also be a concern because you need to put it in a context of leveraging and balancing power in some sense too.
You all both spoke about the need to bring the sacred or to see the sacred in ordinary times, in the everyday, and in the streets. And I'm thinking about how binary church has been. Either it is good or is bad. And how that binary, this is sin or it's good. And that often is the thing that keeps the religious out of the street, that keeps I wouldn't say the religious, but the spiritual out of the streets. And I'm wondering your thoughts around what does it take for the church, and I'll say Big C Church, Church Universal, to get beyond its Western European thoughts of within the binary and I think about it as more African, there's no separation between the sacred and the secular, to be able to not just think of things in black and white, but fully in color, to be able to shade and see the fullness of what is happening, so that how then the laity or all of us are able to show up outside of the church walls is a full reflection of God's love and light in the world.
I'm going to start talking, but I don't know that I believe what I'm about to say. So bear with me. Some way, somehow, we have to help folks and ourselves understand the church is not the building. And therefore, if what goes on inside the building does not correlate with anything outside the building, it is not church. So what do you want to be? The building or the church? If we're going to work with binaries. Now, ideally, you could do both, but it's very rare that we see that happen. So I think it's a long cultivation process within a congregation to help folk see that creation is much bigger than the address of the church, and much bigger than they can see, or we can see. And I think that's the end of my brain fart, because I would have to think about it a lot more.
Continue that theme of whether we think about centering congregations on the mystery of God or just the expansiveness of God, to reintroduce a curiosity about where God is, and the naming the new, and that we worship a living God, and that our moral surety is not the ticket to heaven, but the relationship with the expansiveness of God is our invitation to salvation, which is wholeness. And so I think the closing for security is because we actually don't know that we're beloved by God and believe that other people are. And I worry, I even worry when we get a little bit too social justice-y in our congregational worship, because I always want to be surprised by where God is. And I have some criteria, certainly, but it is actually, maybe it's now having kids just like, oh, I never saw that before. I also want that in my worship. Oh, we read these same texts every single year. What are we doing? I mean, 3-year lectionary cycle maybe, but it's because there's actually something new. And this, we go over the same stuff, not so we have it locked up, but because there's always newness in there. And I worry that we've lost our curiosity in relationships, in worship, in politics. Our curiosity has, maybe it's lots of trauma, but leaning into that would be the hope for some of that.
Thank you, Dr. Snar. We have about 5 minutes left. We'll have one final question, and then we will break for the afternoon.
Thank you so much. And one of the things that I appreciate most, as you were saying, listening, is not only that, but slowing down and being still. So the fact that when I saw that you all had called this together, I just said, what a blessing. How wonderful. I had the privilege this morning of going to meet with Jake Sherrill, who's had a barbershop for over 60 years. He's 96 years old, was being interviewed because he won the Evangelism Award. And we know that the barbershop was the place not just for a haircut and for a shave. As one of the workers said, when you walk through the door, it was the place for act rightness. When you walk through the door, Jake was going to tell you about God. If you worked in his shop, you were going to church on Sunday, even if it meant you were sleeping at his house. And so when you say church, it's not just what happens, as one pastor said, from the invocation to benediction, but what happens from the benediction to the invocation. And so as a pastor, I think what I think as we as churches have turned inwardly, we focused on charity and not justice. And justice is a piece of that is not being raised up and lived out. And so what are your thoughts as far as how do we help not only our congregations, but here in the seminary itself, of letting us know, church leaders as well as congregations, that it's not a single, as you said, salvation is not single, salvation is communal. But how do we continue to put that out on a day-to-day of how to live that out in the place where you're planted?
When I was but a wee young preacher, and was in a difficult conflict with a parishioner, I was talking with a friend who was a lot wiser than I was and probably still is, and describing the situation and like, what do I do? What do I do? And she stopped me and said, you can't do anything. What you can do is model with integrity what you're preaching and what you're speaking. And people will see that, and that's what brings in change. But, you know, this is up to God. It's not it's not. And I thought about that, and at least it got better for me, because I was no longer under the false notion that if I could just find the right thing to say, then it would be all right. No, I had to model, and it took a lot longer, but in the end, I began to see the wisdom of that. So we as leaders have to be consistent. We have to have integrity. Folks want to know that there's a touchstone in us when all chaos is surrounding what's going on, they can count on. And that kind of touchstone, that kind of anchor, I think helps. But it's also going to have to take the willing spirit of those we're in community with. And that one, that's a whole nother lunchtime conversation, cultivating a willing spirits. And I'm glad I'm not on the docket for that one.
I will probably, I bet you have as many answers and even some of the stories that you're telling to your own questions. So I look forward to actually hearing in other lunchtime conversations from you. I will share just thinking about doing justice, but in a way that connects to everyday folks' lives. I'm more congregationally connected than I've ever been. I mean, I've been along the way, but it's in part because I lived in a community that the tornado came right through and literally destroyed our church. And And it made me reflect on this process of why it's changed. We're still a church in diaspora, worshiping at Warner Elementary. Our congregation got better. We got smaller, but we got better at asking, where are you hurting? But we also got better at not seeing stuff as private pain and moving it to public lament. And I think that's what social movements do, really. They even ritualize mourning in a way that, but attending to private pain, and part of the role of the minister or the organizer, whoever is it goes all the way back to even something Walter Rauschenbusch in his early stuff said, when I notice things going along the same lines of all of, you have to name them. And I think if we can work together to move our private pains, what seems to be private pain in our communities, and to be connected enough in our communities, to a kind of public lament, and then what that means in terms of the steps for justice and reconciliation. I mean reconciliation as in making right relationships. I think that movement, we've gotten, last thing I'll say is, reframing charity to mutual aid. I think I'm learning from another generation of folks who talk about mutual aid as being so important in movements. And even beginning to not talk about charity in our churches, but mutual aid, which is absolutely what our neighborhoods had to do that were struck by the tornadoes. And seeing that as a paradigm for what it means to then change structures, I think becomes really. So I think there's an invitation from the spirit of movements right now to think about charity being caritas, a kind of love that's actually about mutual aid more than anything, and what that might get us closer to justice in our churches, perhaps, as well.
All right. Thank you both, Dean Towns and Dr. Snar, and thank you to our guests today for your questions. Before we exit, I might just ask you again, just to kind of ground yourself and think of the wisdom that was shared here in the room. I asked at the beginning what brought you here, and I hope that you found that here in this space. I hope that you are leaving with a new piece of knowledge or a new thought. And I hope you go and spend the rest of your day in peace. Thank you, everyone.